All right, this is 529 and another video on structure.
All right, let's dive a little deeper into plot points. I told you there were five, and let's go through them one by one. The first is the point of attack. The point of attack is the event that propels your protagonist into the story. And by that, I mean it's the first event that disrupts the status quo. It usually happens at the end of the first sequence and is the first appearance or hint of the larger main tension that will define the second act. In the hero's journey, which we'll talk more about in week 4, this is called the call to adventure. Something from outside the protagonist's ordinary world intrudes. Now, the point of attack is sometimes used interchangeably with inciting incident, but I actually think that these are two different points. The inciting incident, for many screenwriters like me, is the first incident within the ordinary world that starts the chain of cause and effect, such that all the scenes fall like dominoes thereafter. Don't worry too much about this right now. We'll circle back to inciting incident around mid-semester. The next major plot point is the first act break. The first act break usually has 4 elements. One, it's the moment where the protagonist is locked in and there is no going back to the status quo. 2, the protagonist has made a decision to pursue their want, and that want is clear. 3, the main tension has been clearly established, and this is really the most important part, because the second act in general is defined by main tension being established and then resolved. And then lastly, the exposition of the setup is mostly in place. In other words, there's no more information that we need to know in order for the story to launch. Now, this usually happens at the end of the second sequence, but not always. But by definition, it is the boundary between the first and second act. In the hero's journey, the first act break is the point in the metaphorical quest where the protagonist leaves the comfort and familiarity of the ordinary world in order to pursue some want, and so crosses over a metaphorical threshold to a new and unfamiliar world. Next is the first culmination. The first culmination is a major shift in the main tension around the midpoint of the film, but not necessarily at the midpoint itself, which is why we don't simply call it the midpoint. The first culmination is the hardest plot point for students to find when analyzing movies because this shift in the main tension manifests itself in different ways in different movies. So rather than give a strict definition, we can list the kinds of shifts like symptoms you may or may not see in the first culmination. So, the first culmination often, but not always, contains a false victory or false defeat, a major revelation, recognition, or reversal, a raising of the stakes, making things much more difficult for the hero. It is often our first glimpse at a possible ending for the story, creating audience speculation and anticipation. And lastly, it is often, but not always, the case that the midpoint mirrors the climax, in the sense that if this is a story in which the protagonist ultimately wins and ends at a high point, then the midpoint is likely to be a false victory, followed by a low point near the end of the second act. Conversely, if the story is a tragedy, the first culmination is often a false defeat, followed by a high point at the end of the second act. Anyway, don't just cut the running time of the movie in half and expect to find the first culmination. It's likely in the vicinity of the midpoint, but it varies from story to story. Now, the second culmination happens at the end of the second act and usually the end of the sixth sequence. It has a much more straightforward definition. It marks the resolution of the main tension. Whatever main tension was hinted at in the point of attack and established in the first act break is now resolved one way or the other. The resolution usually takes the form of the protagonist either getting what they want, what they set out for, or failing to get what they want. Just before or just after the second culmination is often a dark night of the soul. This is the hero's lowest point in the whole story, in which all seems lost. But soon after the main tension is resolved, at the second culmination, a new third act tension is established. It could be that the protagonist discovers one final way to get what they want, or it could mean that the protagonist now wants something entirely different. like Thornhill. All he wanted in the second act was to find Kaplan and clear his name, but in the third act he wants something new, to save Eve. All right, and now the last plot point, the climax. This is a moment near the very end of the film. The climax is the moment of greatest tension and conflict, in which the outcome of the story seemingly will be decided one way or the other. Now, the resolution of the film could be happy or sad. What happens after the climax may be clear or ambiguous, but whatever tensions were, again, suggested in the point of attack and established in the first act break and complicated and escalated in the first culmination, revised in the second culmination, must come to a clear resolution one way or the other at the climax. The key point to remember is that structure is created by tension. It's a function of the storytelling. It's a function of what information the storyteller is withholding from the audience, what events the storyteller is choosing to show. This creates the tension, that creates the sequences, that binds the whole second act together. And when you're looking for those key plot points, those key moments when things shift in the story, what you're really looking for is that shift in tension.